Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, we've got some major problems with our electrical grid here in the United States. Unfortunately, many of it was preventable. Much of it was preventable. We'll get into all the details coming up. And a good Monday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show with you 24/7 on demand. It's real simple and completely free. Just search for the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app or visit the website nickcraig.com. Our show this morning brought to you by Melissa Gott and the team over at the Law Group here in Wilmington. For any legal questions that you might have, any legal challenges, 910-251-6088, or visit them online, lawgroupnc.com. We'll hear more from them coming up a little bit later on in the program this morning. Over the last couple of months, you have probably seen a lot of discussion on social media, a lot of postings, and even some more traditional news reports over concerns with artificial intelligence data centers. This has been kind of a hot button issue in the public eye in recent months, as many of these facilities that are being built or proposed to be built, in fact, use a lot of electricity and a lot of water. And while there are concerns, and there should be legitimate discussions over how much power some of these facilities are, for all intents and purposes, sucking down, the larger conversation is one that really needs to be played out, and that is the disservice that the United States has done to its electrical infrastructure over the last 10 to 15 years. The AI, a lot of the emphasis here is on AI data centers and data centers in general. And while, yes, there's some very real concerns there, and I understand why people are frustrated, concerned, maybe a little bit annoyed as to what's going on, I am here to tell you today that the AI infrastructure, these AI data centers, are not the actual problem. Now, they might be bringing the problem to light. They might be taking an already existing issue and boiling it to the top, but AI data centers and data centers in general are not the issue. Over the last 15 years here in the United States, 15 to 20 years here in the United States, we have seen environmental activists take control of state utility groups and organizations. When there are Democrats in Washington, D.C., we see them take control of these groups that continually force unreliable, expensive forms of electrical generation down our throats. And the forms that we're talking about are wind and solar. This is not to say that there is not a place for wind power and solar power. I believe that there is. But for this discussion for this to make full sense, you have to understand what is a term that is defined as base load power. Things like coal, natural gas, and nuclear are considered base load power. Why is that the case? Because they are consistently producing a defined amount of electricity. And with things like nuclear, like coal, like natural gas, they are baseload. They don't fluctuate all that often. Now, you can, of course, turn some of those facilities up and then bring them back a little bit. So there's a little bit of variation, but for the most part, those facilities operate as what is described and defined as baseload power generation. And we inherently need baseload power, right? Your air conditioner, especially this time of year with it being so hot out over the last couple of months, your air conditioner kicks on in cycles. If you're lucky, every 30 minutes, but if you're unlucky, every 15 or 20 minutes, especially during the middle of the day. Your refrigerator, your freezer, that stuff kicks on a cycle. You've got lights that are on and so on and so forth. That is electricity that falls under the category of baseload. And so you've got these forms of electrical generation that are very stable and very reliable, like wind coal, natural gas, and nuclear. And then you've got these other forms, predominantly wind and solar, that do not fit that definition. Just inherently, based on the technology, solar and wind cannot be baseload. Why? Because they don't produce a defined amount of electricity consistently. Obviously, look at solar. I know it's a crazy thing to talk about, but when the sun is not shining, solar panels are not generating a lot, or if any, electricity. In the middle of the night, there is no electricity being generated by solar facilities. When it is not incredibly windy, the wind turbines are not generating consistent amounts of electricity. Just based on the technologies themselves, they cannot fall under the category of what is described as baseload power. And so the point of this is not to say that wind and solar suck, because I actually don't believe that. The thing that sucks is that when you, as a left-wing organization controlling power utilities across the United States, when you say we're going to shut down a coal plant, which is, as we've already described, baseload power, we're going to shut that facility down and replace it with wind and solar. That's the issue. You are taking what is inherently reliable forms of electrical generation like coal and replacing it with inherently unreliable forms of electrical generation like wind and solar. And again, that is not to say that wind and solar are bad. They're just not reliable. And so if you're going to be pulling resources off the grid, if you're going to be shutting down power plants that are baseload, you need to replace them with baseload. You can't replace them with something like wind and solar. It just doesn't work. And so as this discussion continues to play out, and as there is a lot of anxiety and frustration and concern with predominantly AI data centers and the massive amount of electricity that they use, that is not the issue. We need to look at the energy policies that have taken place in many states and in large part across the United States over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years. Because I would argue that a lot of what the discussion is right now was and is completely preventable and completely avoidable. And I caught this very interesting article over at Real Clear Energy over the weekend. It's written by Jay Rogers, and I just loved the headline on it. It's why it popped out at me on the screen. His headline is "Solar, Wind, and the Cost of Pretending." And that so perfectly wraps up this entire conversation. Solar and wind and the cost of pretending, because that is exactly what has gone on. We as a nation, because this is the push that has taken place, we have wrapped ourselves up in this position where we have completely ignored any sort of reality as it relates to electrical generation, any sort of reality as to how we generate electricity, and run full steam ahead in many cases to these quote-unquote environmentally friendly, which of course they're not, renewable forms of electrical generation. All in large part so that those on the political left can pat themselves on the back and claim that we're saving the climate. We're saving the environment. If you want to be able to turn on your lights, if you want your air conditioning and heat and things of that nature to run reliably, it's not that important. We've got to save the environment. We've got to protect Mother Nature. We've got to protect Mother Earth. And the only way to do that is to shut down baseload power generation facilities like coal and like natural gas and replace them in large part with solar panels and wind turbines that are, of course, developed in China and are not environmentally friendly in any way, shape, or form. But that's the narrative. That's the push that's been going on. And if we do not course correct on this, unfortunately, a lot of work is being done right now. We've seen obviously major policy shifts in Washington, D.C. since President Donald Trump was able to get back into the Oval Office. If we don't handle this carefully, we could be looking at a dire situation across the entirety of the United States of America. That is a very real risk. If we do not bolster our electrical generation, if we do not make smart decisions, not political decisions, but smart decisions moving forward with our electrical grid, we could be looking at a very grave future as it relates to electrical generation. So we're talking about the power grid, electrical generation. A lot of this is boiled into the public discussion and conversation because of AI data centers, and there's a lot of anxiety and stress about those. We've seen municipalities here across the state of North Carolina and in other places across the U.S. come out with these data center moratoriums, as the public says, my power bills are going up because of these data centers. And while it seems like that is the case, that's not actually true. Your power bill through Duke is not going up because of data centers. Your power bill through Duke is going up because of 20 years of short-sighted and, in large part, what I will argue, stupid decisions as it relates to our electrical grid. I mentioned this article I caught over at Real Clear Energy written by Jay Rogers. The headline there is Solar, Wind, and the Cost of Pretending. And I just wanted to read through just a little bit of this article that he put together and was published over at Real Clear Energy because it does such a phenomenal job of really breaking down what the issue here is in the United States of America and what needs to be done. So he starts off the article by saying this: Americans are told to trust the energy transition, which of course is the move to things like solar and wind, applaud the subsidies, and ignore the mess left behind when the ribbon is cut. That works until the bill arrives, the grids get strained, or someone asks what happens to the blade the size of a jet wing when a wind turbine reaches the end of its life. And it's totally predictable because the push towards solar and wind was nothing to do and had nothing to do at all with actual good discussions and science and or anything like that. It had everything to do with emotion. It had everything to do with political opinion. And that has left us in a very miserable situation. He goes on in his article to say, the Energy Information Administration classifies wind and solar as intermittent resources, which of course they are, meaning they only generate when the weather cooperates. A grid built around intermittent power still requires backup generation, transmission upgrades, and storage. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave U.S. energy infrastructure a D+ in its 2025 report card, down from a C- 4 years earlier, the only major category to decline. About 80% of the $186.4 billion spent by investor-owned utilities in 2024 went to infrastructure upgrades. He goes on to say full modernization of the grid will cost hundreds of billions of more, and that cost lands somewhere, and the ratepayers know where. And so this discussion, again, about intermittent or inherently unreliable forms of electricity compared to traditional baseload power is a real thing. And this coincides with an article that I caught over at the John Locke Foundation. It was written back a couple of months ago by John Sanders, and he highlights this same issue but brings it into the North Carolina vein. He writes in his article, in discussing this, power like solar and wind cannot be added to the electrical grid without backup generation. It noted that despite that fact, which it is a fact, right? If you're going to put solar and wind on the grid, you have to have some form of energy to back it up, because if the wind is not blowing, if the sun is not shining, you're not generating electricity. He notes that the North Carolina Utilities Commission, which of course is filled with Democrats, excludes the cost of backup generation in evaluating solar projects. Its cost to ratepayers, even though those costs will be added to the customer's bills. So he writes, in other words, the North Carolina Utility Commission treats solar necessary firming or regulating reserves not as a consequence of adding solar to the grid, but as if they are just another cost of doing business as a utility. He writes that this selective accounting is inexplicable. It makes solar projects seem more price competitive against reliable, dispatchable power generation resources, and it is especially troubling because the North Carolina Utilities Commission is legally required to promote adequate, reliable, and economically affordable utility services to all citizens and residents of the state. So listen, let me break down the scam that's going on here. So a company says, we're going to build a massive solar farm. They, of course, have to go through the North Carolina Utilities Commission. There's a lot of red tape, a lot of bloat, a lot of regulation. No surprise there as it relates to that. What is not included, let's just use very basic round numbers. Let's say that it's going to cost $100 million to build a solar facility. Right? That's the cost. I don't think that's an accurate price, but let's just use that number. $100 million to build this major solar facility. This goes to the North Carolina Utilities Commission through this entire process, and they say, sure, we can move forward with that because it's going to cost $100 million versus maybe $300 million to build another facility. What is not included in what John Sanders writes in this article over at the John Locke Foundation, what is not included in that $100 million price tag is the fact that the solar has to be backed up. And that typically happens with natural gas or large battery facilities, SMR, small modular nuclear, whatever it might be. There has to be a backstop for the solar. So when the Utilities Commission, all controlled almost exclusively by Democrats, is making these determinations, they're not looking at the full picture. They're not looking at the entire conversation. And that would be like you going to a car dealership and purchasing and looking at a sticker price on a car, but the car has no brakes, no rotors, and no wheels, right? You're not looking at the full picture. You're not looking at the full equation. The car might be $30,000, but it has no axles, no brakes, no rotors, and no wheels. So you'd say, oh, this is a great deal. This car's 30 grand. What a phenomenal deal. Except you're missing a lot of the key functionality of a car, right? It's not the full picture. You can't just look at one little subsection, one little area and say, yeah, seems like a great deal. And they're doing this, and I would argue intentionally, because they will claim it is cheaper to build these facilities while ignoring all of these discussions, all of the very real consequences of building these facilities. And so while a lot of this discussion is now taking place revolving around data centers and AI data centers and things of that nature, that's not the issue. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no issues with that. I'm not saying that at all. But the reason that we are in the mess that we are is because power utilities, left-wing utilities, commissions, so on and so forth, have made these decisions, have made these choices, and completely ignored the realities that are pretty well understood. Electrical generation is not new technology. It has existed now for quite some time. I think it is fair to say, well over a century. And so when these decisions are being made on a pretty well understood industry, ignoring any sort of fact or reality, it hurts you and I, the ratepayer, because we are the ones that have to come in on the backside and cover these major bills. That's the gripe. That's the issue. That's the problem that has been created. We have ignored reality and decided that people's feelings and opinions and this BS known as climate change is the grandiose solution to everything. And so fact and reality be damned, as long as we can pat ourselves on the back and claim and proclaim that we are saving the environment, that we are making the earth cooler. We're not raising the temperature of Mother Earth, whatever sort of stupid nonsense is claimed. It's totally absurd. It's totally foolish. And again, unfortunately, I believe it is leading us down a very, very dangerous road that could have major implications and impacts for the entirety of the United States. I'll get into some more thoughts on this coming up here in just a couple of minutes. But before that, I want to tell you about the law group here in Wilmington and remind you that when any legal questions or challenges may arise, and they do from time to time, make sure you put your trust in the law group right here in Wilmington. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across the eastern half of our state. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong defense, no matter the issue, the law group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved promptly. They're located in downtown Wilmington. They're not some big national law firm, and they're just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online, lawgroupnc.com. They've got a great blog over there. You can read more about Melissa Gott and her entire team. Lawgroupnc.com is the website, 910-251-6088, or again online, lawgroupnc.com. It's the Law Group, experience and dedication you can rely on. We appreciate the Law Group and their continued support here of the Nick Craig Show. More on this on the other side, plus we'll get into some of your comments as well as the Nick Craig Show continues on this Monday morning, streaming live, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7, wherever you get your podcasts. And a good Monday to you. Welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Coming up Thursday, we'll be doing our June Patreon Hangout for those that support the show over at patreon.com/Nick Craig. We get together once a month on a Zoom call, typically a couple of hours. We get together at 7 o'clock. That is coming up Thursday night. That is June the 25th at 7 p.m. You can get access to that for as little as $5 a month, plus access to our daily show notes and more. A lot of notes in today's show. All of that available. Patreon.com/Nick Craig. You can also find the link over at nickcraig.com. Appreciate your continued support and looking forward to chatting with everybody Thursday night on our Nick Craig Show monthly Patreon Hangout. We are talking about the electrical grid today. There's a lot of discussion that is taking place lately due to AI. And you've seen in town and city councils all across the United States, city council rooms packed, people showing up and saying and demanding a moratorium on AI data centers and data centers in general, saying they're using too much electricity, we're footing the bill. And while there's some truth to that, and there's, by the way, some solutions that we'll get into as we continue through the program today, the bigger concern and the bigger issue is not, from my vantage point, is not AI data centers. And it's not data centers at all. The concern is that we have ignored reality. This great article over at Real Clear Energy. We have spent the last 2 decades pretending that solar and wind are replaceable for baseload electrical generation or dispatchable electrical generation. That has led us to the position we're in right now. That has led us, unfortunately, to our own demise. It was short-sighted, stupid, emotional, political decisions that were made, and we're now paying, literally, and when we say paying for it, I mean literally paying for it right now. As you have seen in many cases, if you're in North Carolina, your Duke Energy bills skyrocket over the last couple of years. You're not using that much more energy, but the costs are going up. And it's because traditional baseload forms of electrical generation are being shut down, and in the wings, no pun intended, are things like wind and solar, which are inherently unreliable and inherently very expensive forms of electrical generation. Let's get over to a couple of comments. Comment coming in. It says, Duke Energy Progress is definitely concerned with our grid. Seems like weekly emails asking you to conserve by reducing energy between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. on specific days. Oh, absolutely. And you've seen those emails come in. You've seen those. You've gotten those text messages from places like Duke. That you are staring down the barrel of what the future could look like if these horrific decisions are not stopped. If we don't sober up and come to the realization that these policies are so incredibly stupid, the reality is going to be what you have out right now in a state like California. It is 2020, middle of 2026. We very clearly understand how to produce and generate electricity. This is not new science. This is not a new industry by any stretch of the imagination. We understand this process. And a state like California still has rolling black and brownouts. Still. Like every day in the summer. Certain areas, certain pockets of the state of California have their power cut for hours on end. You're seeing it over in places in Europe right now. Germany is probably the greatest example of this. Over the last 20 years, they shut down and took axes to their coal and natural gas facilities, built all these solar farms and put all these wind turbines up, and now they're facing a major dooming electrical collapse. They can't generate enough electricity for their population. They don't have the baseload generation ability. Folks, this is real stuff. It's not a tinfoil hat conspiracy. This is not some theoretical discussion on what might happen in the future. It is happening right now in various places across the globe. And you can look at so-called renewable, so-called affordable energy that have led us to this position. Another comment coming in. I have solar panels, and at the end of every May, Duke resets your banked kilowatt hours and doesn't pay you a dime for it. They are thieves. Well, that's the reality. And again, solar and wind, I do believe, have a place. It is amazing technology that you can place a panel in at a specific angle to maximize sun and generate electricity. The technology is fascinating. Is there a future for things like wind and solar? I genuinely believe the answer is yes. I do. We will probably at some point get to a position, get to a period of time where that stuff makes a lot more sense. The argument I will make, and the argument that you hear many make, is that we're just not there yet. Will we get there? Probably. Why do I say that? Because technology evolves. We've seen this. We've seen major technological advances over the last 50 or 60 years in a wide range of industries. I mean, 60 years ago, the idea of a computer was foreign. I mean, it practically didn't exist. You had very, very rudimentary technology. And in just a relatively short span of time, we have now seen a situation where everybody is walking around with a high-powered computer in the cost of in the palm of their hands at a relatively low cost. Now, I'm not saying that phones are cheap, but in the grand scheme of things, a relatively low cost. Even 30 years ago, you were spending thousands of dollars for computers. You can now go into any big box store and for $300 or $400 pick up a brand new laptop. Right? So the technology evolves, technology changes, and I believe, and I'm not saying this that I know for certain, but I believe that we will probably get to a point where wind and solar make more sense. But we just aren't there right now, and making short-sighted, emotional political decisions to jettison these technologies forward with ignoring all the realities and all the issues that it creates is incredibly stupid. So back to this article over at Real Clear Energy, there's an example of the problem and the situation that has been created. The author of this writes, Evan Path is a case study that the clean energy lobby would rather forget. The $2.2 billion facility received a $1.6 billion federal loan guarantee, a $539 million Treasury grant, and a 30% investment tax credit and accelerated depreciation of the facility. Despite all of that, it never came close to the 1 million megawatt hours per year it promised, averaging just 702,000 megawatt hours through 2023. And it's now twice expensive to run as an ordinary solar facility. California regulators refuse to let it close, trapping ratepayers in an estimated $100 million per year in excise costs. The company that operates it received a $535 million Department of Energy loan guarantee in 2009 and then went on to file for bankruptcy in 2011. The Department of Energy Inspector General found executives had engaged in what he called an orchestrated effort to knowingly and intentionally deceive. Governments are not good at picking technological winners. The market has a longer memory than a press release. And unfortunately, that is exactly what has happened, right? At the beginning of this article, I read a segment or two ago, the subsidies discussion was in here. The reason that in the past you've seen so much build out in solar and wind is because in large part, state and more predominantly federal governments have been heavily subsidizing these programs. Your and my taxpayer dollars have gone up to Washington, D.C., and then been doled out to these major companies to produce these facilities because they can't do it without the subsidies. And that is a situation where you have governments picking winners and losers. And if we know anything about government, and unfortunately I know more than more than most, we know that government does a horrific job at doing this. They do an awful job at predicting winners and losers. They will shovel literally hundreds of billions of dollars at something that makes absolutely no sense. Why? Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it is not their money. And because it is not their money, they don't care. They don't care. It's not their money that they're losing. The Department of Energy gives a $500 million loan to this California solar company. They file for bankruptcy 2 freaking years later. They don't care. It's not like the Department of Energy is out any money. It wasn't their money to begin with. It wasn't their money to start. So it's just this, yeah, we'll throw some money at it. Maybe the problem gets solved. Maybe it doesn't. But at the end of the day, who really cares? Not a big problem. Just kind of ignore it. Yeah, no, don't talk about that. But hey, look at this, climate change graph or some other stupid nonsense. That's what the focus should be. That's where the major discussion should be taking place. I mean, it's totally absurd and totally ridiculous. Rounding out our discussion on the this looming electrical issue that I see taking place here in the United States, a major topic of discussion most recently because of AI data centers and things of that nature. So let's transition into that. I caught another interesting piece from John Sanders over at the John Locke Foundation. This is back from early March, talking about the electrical demand of these data centers. And again, not to ignore any of those concerns, not to kind of wipe away any of those problems there, but a lot of this is preventable and a lot of this is completely avoidable. So John Sanders wrote back in early March, after years of steady electrical demand, the steep rise in artificial intelligence, data centers, and certain other power-hungry industrial customers poses distinct problems for power grids as currently regulated. North Carolina is hardly immune to these problems. Electricity customers in North Carolina are best with several pressing needs. How to obtain new energy generation resources specifically to cover data center needs. How to protect the reliability of the grid from this new power demand before enough new generation comes online. How to shield households and other customers from rate increases from having to build all of those resources. And the fourth question, how to protect ratepayers from the risk that the data center bubble bursting and straining the grid with expensive resources. Policymakers must find an answer to address all these needs simultaneously. If that's not challenging enough, however, they must find it soon. Nevertheless, decisions regarding the electrical grid are governed largely by the North Carolina Utilities Commission, which is a deliberative public body and therefore slow. And the major takeaway from his article, which will be in the show notes over at patreon.com/Nick Craig, is these major tech companies that want to make these investments, right? When you're talking about Google or Amazon or Microsoft or OpenAI or any of these other companies, NVIDIA, investing in these facilities, they are investing large sums of money to bring these facilities online. These private companies, I know, crazy. These private companies have a financial interest in bringing these facilities online. And so the simple solution for this is allow these companies to build their own electrical generation. Allow them, as John Sanders writes in his article, to build, bring, or buy their own power. He writes in part, in some parts of the country, major tech companies have announced agreements to receive power from existing nuclear facilities or even develop new ones. For example, in 2024, Google announced an agreement with Kairos Power in California to develop 6 or 7 small modular nuclear reactors known as SMRs to fill their power requirements for AI. Amazon has announced agreements to develop SMRs in Washington state, exploring doing so in Virginia, and partnering with existing facilities in Pennsylvania to power their AI operations. That's actually 3 Mile Island, funny enough. Microsoft's AI operations will receive power from the nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island, which had been closed but will be reactivated for this project. That's the solution. That's the ability. That's how we begin this process of moving forward. There's a reason why more of these data centers, and it's not just data centers, it's industrial companies as well. I mean, you think about, for example, Toyota's got a major facility here in North Carolina. A company called Jet Zero is building a major facility up in the Piedmont Triad at the Piedmont Triad Regional Airport. They're building that facility there. An industrial customer that is producing airplanes or cars is going to need a lot of electricity as well. I know a lot of the focus and a lot of the online chatter and a lot of the concern at municipal, city council, county commission meetings is all around AI and these AI data centers. But this broader discussion should be large industrial customers as a whole. And the solution, as John Sanders lays out, is one that I think is very logical. Remove the red tape, remove the bureaucracy, remove the nonsense, and allow these companies to build or buy directly their own electricity. And this is something that even seemingly Democrats are on board with. Here in North Carolina, the governor has what he calls the North Carolina Energy Policy Task Force, which he created by executive order. And one of their recommendations is this, quote, develop options to enable bring your own capacity and alternate capacity procurement pathways, including potential clean energy specific pathways, which of course we know won't work. Potential options could include legislation enabling large customers to produce their own capacity through new generation, storage, or distributed energy resources. A clean transition tariff provision included with a large load tariff allowing for choice in generating resources, or sleeved power purchase agreements defined as three-way contractual relationships between the customers, the utility, and a third-party supplier. Now, obviously, a lot of this green and clean energy discussion is total nonsense, but the overall premise of bring your own capacity makes a lot of sense. And we really can boil this conversation down to a much larger discussion and debate. Who knows best when it comes to business? Is it government or is it private industry? When tough decisions, when large financial investments need to be made, who traditionally does a better job in doing so? Is it government, state, federal, local, or is it private business, mom and pop, mid-size, large industry? The answer is almost always the private sector, because they have shareholders and investors and employees and other folks that they have to answer to. And if they make a very poor financial decision, it can have a catastrophic impact. It can cause a company to shutter. It can cause a company to fold and no longer exist. And that is why when businesses make decisions, they do so very carefully. When government makes a poor decision, which seemingly they always do, what's the solution? What's the end result? The poor decision is made. The money, in many cases, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, depending on what you're talking about, are wasted. They clean their hands of it, shake their hands off, and say, all right, on to the next. No accountability, no after-action report, no discussion as to how we don't do this in the future. They just wipe their hands clean of it and move on. On to the next shiny object. On to the next big pressing issue that government must deal with. We see it literally all the time. And so I am a strong believer in our free market capitalist system. And I believe that if a major tech company believes that there's a need for an AI data center, that they should be able to build that. And they should be able to figure out how to power said facility. That needs to be where the discussion turns. That needs to be where this conversation moves towards. Because just standing up and saying no more AI, no more data centers, no more technological innovation is a horrific policy for the United States and would absolutely give our adversaries in places like China the ability to spring ahead of the United States in this rapidly advancing sector. Your problem is not AI data centers. Your problem is wacko environmental leftists that have ignored the reality of how to generate electricity, how to provide electricity to customers over the last 10, 15, or 20 years, and all of those horrific, terrible decisions are now being faced by you and I. And that is the reason why you are seeing your utility bills absolutely explode in so many places across the country. Short-sighted, stupid decisions made by these environmental leftist wackos that have now come to your front door and are in your mailbox every single month. I mean, it was totally expected, totally preventable, totally avoidable. And I think we've kind of hit the breaking point with this stuff where many are sobering up and saying, yes, it's not good. We made some pretty boneheaded, some pretty stupid decisions in the past, and now we've got to figure out how to deal with this stuff. It again, is a situation that could have been, in large part, completely prevented. But, like many times, we've seen emotion and politics overweigh logical, rational decision-making. I'll have links to the couple of different articles, some great stuff over at the John Locke Foundation. Those will be in our show notes over at patreon.com/Nick Craig. A lot of stuff going on internationally as well. The UK Prime Minister resigning early this morning. Vice President J.D. Vance over in Switzerland announcing just moments ago that major progress has been made as the U.S. continues to negotiate with Iran and works towards finalizing a deal. I'll be keeping an eye on a couple of those things more behind the scenes over the next couple of days. And as soon as we get some concrete information, some concrete ways as to how we move forward with this, I'll bring you the details first on social media if time permits, and then bring them to you here on the Nick Craig Show. Well, that's going to do it for a Monday edition. Thanks to the Law Group here in Wilmington for their continued support, 910-251-6088 or lawgroupnc.com. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app, and is heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Enjoy your Monday. We'll do it again tomorrow morning right here on The Nick Craig Show.